Okay, this is Mark. I'm here with Dick Benner. This is our first attempt at a podcast and to get some of Dick's stories and experiences on record. But anyway, we talked about a bunch of different things that we'd like to talk about, but we'd like to go, I think for the first one, we're going to go over all the engine failures that Dick has had flying through Alaska. Hi, Dick. Where do you want to start?
Oh boy, a little bit of my history. I was born here in Alaska and started flying with my father back in the 50s, and he became a homesteader about 50 miles out of Anchorage to the north and built this little airstrip, and he would commute to Anchorage to work every day in an old Stinson, 1946 small tail Stinson 108. And that's where I got my earliest flying experiences, was in the back seat of this Stinson. And I just fell in love with flying. And I thought, oh, I just can't wait to get my own airplane. And so I had such a passion growing. And part of my chores at the homestead was servicing the airplane and making it ready for his flight every morning. So I would gas it up and take the wing covers off if needed and just make sure it was ready to go. And I was like 10 years old when I was doing this, and I thought, man, this is the way to go. You know, don't drive over those rutty, beat up old roads, and just get in an airplane, and in a few minutes you're in Anchorage. It was great. And so anyway, every chance I got to be around an airplane, I took advantage of it, and this meant sometimes getting on the bicycle and bicycling to the airport and just watching the airplanes land and take off. And it wasn't long, and I was in a high school down in Kenai, and after school I'd get off the school bus and walk to the airport and I'd take flying lessons. And that's how I got started with my own flying. And when I was a sophomore in high school, I purchased a 1946 Taylorcraft and got checked out in it and almost lived in the airplane for like 3 years. I mean, I was every waking moment that I wasn't in school or working or whatever, I was at the airport messing with my airplane and flying it. And
was that the airplane you soloed in?
No, I sold it in a Cessna 150, 1967 Cessna 150. And so anyway, that's some of my early flying history and how I got started in all of it. But watching airplanes, in fact, this morning I was out at the airport. I live near Birchwood, and they've got a really nice airport that was originally built in World War II it was a satellite field for Anchorage. And it used to be very quiet, but now it's kind of been discovered, and there's hangars going up and people flying in and out of there a lot. So it offers a good, I like just to watch airplanes land and take off too. And sure. I don't mind doing touch and goes all day long. As long as I'm in the air, I'm a happy camper. And I've had a chance to own a lot of different airplanes, J3s, Luscombs, Taylorcrafts, T6s, just a lot of airplanes. And I've, with all that different varied experience, and when you buy these used airplanes, you're buying someone else's project sometimes, as I may say, and so you run into different problems. And I've had my share of engine problems, and I guess that's what we're going to kind of focus on today.
And maybe we can help some pilots or learn from your experiences.
I sure hope so.
Hopefully part of the goal of what we're doing now.
That's right. When I was very young, I was 8 years old, or 7 years old, and I was at Merrill Field, and I was watching the plane off my sister's bicycle. I didn't have a bicycle then. I borrowed my sister's bike, and I every other day when the weather was halfway decent, I'd go over to Merrill Field and just sit at the end of the runway. Back then you could do that. There were no fences, and you could get within 100 foot of the threshold and nobody would care as long as you weren't in their way. And I'd sit there on the bicycle and watching these airplanes come in and land, trying to figure out what the controls did to make them do what they did. I was trying to figure out what the flippers in the back were doing. And I kind of got a handle on it early on, what made them go, and what made them come down and so forth, in my mind anyway. And I was sitting at the end of the runway on the bike one day, and I heard an engine sputter, and I looked right up above me, about 800 foot up, a PA-11 stalled, and it started spinning. And I, right off the bat, I thought, I didn't think they would allow acrobats to be done in the pattern. I'd never seen an airplane doing acrobats in the pattern. Well, it wasn't intentional. He entered a spin, and he spun down, and they crashed about 250 feet away from me. It was just a terrible sight for a young person to see. And it's just like it happened yesterday in my mind, watching a red and white airplane spin down. Years later, I found out what happened. The fella had been bragging around the airport that his PA-11 could get off quicker, and a friend of mine who was an aeronautical engineer told me just 5 or 6 years ago that he had warned the fella to reposition his rear struts. What he'd done is he'd adjusted the rear struts on this airplane so that the wings were warped down, increasing the lift. Mm-hmm. And he was told that he ought to put that right back where the factory had recommended it, because if you ever got into a stall and a resulting spin, that it would be difficult to get out of the spin if you could at all. And that's exactly what happened to him. He ran out of gas in the pattern and pulled it down to get, I guess, coordinated with the rest of the airplanes. A lot of the planes back then were on lights. They didn't have a radio in them, and that was okay. Mm-hmm. At Merrill Field, you could land and take off just from a light.
Just from lights from the tower.
That's correct. Yeah, taxi, take off, everything. In fact, in my dad's Stinson, I remember him getting the lights quite a few times. I'd sit back there and he'd get a steady green and off we'd go.
It's funny because now when you study for a private pilot license, you learn the lights and you probably almost never see them, if ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
and
right.
Now that's the way they
I've
used
used
to do
them a
it.
few times when I've had radio work. I call them up and make an appointment, and they give me the direction and what to expect and how to respond. And I've done it half a dozen times, and it's rather easy. It's not hard at all. But
so this guy was changing the shape or the twist on the wing, because normally it's designed so the wing root will stall first, so you can feel it, but you still are able to control out at the wingtips or out by the ailerons.
That's
he
right.
was twisting it to try and get more lift, and then he would stall the whole wing all at once.
That's right, and that associated response was a hardship trying to recover from the spin, and I just happened to be the unlucky person to be underneath him when I was looking up into the cockpit almost, and so anyway, that really made an impact on my lust to learn how to fly. But I was determined. So when I started taking my first real instruction down in Kenai after school, my very first flight, I told my flight instructor, and we went up and he was showing me introductory flight. This makes the airplane go up. This makes it turn left and right. And I said, I know all that. I've been riding with my dad. I understand what makes air controls do. I said, what I want to do is learn how to get in and out of a spin. And he looked at me and he says, I'm sorry, but we don't teach that here. It's hard on the equipment, and the FAA doesn't require that as prior knowledge before you solo the airplane or get your private pilot's license even. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but I just bought a 10-hour block of time from these folks. And I said, we might as well go back to the airport, because I've got to get a refund and go to a school that'll teach me that. It's very important to me to know how to get in and out of a spin. And he looked at me and he said, which way do you want to go, left or right? Mm-hmm. So pre-solo, every flight we made out to the practice area, we did a 1 and a half turn spin to the left and a spin to the right. And so before I soloed, I had this recovery from spins down pretty pat. I was really comfortable with the spin. It wasn't a scary thing for me. Now that once I learned the ins and outs, so as to speak, of spinning an airplane, it was no big deal.
Now, for our listeners, but I just want to make sure everybody understands, when we say stall, that's not like the engine stalling. That's a disruption of the lift on the wing, because you have too high of an angle attacking the wind.
That's right.
And then the wing won't fly. And what happened to the accident that Dick described is they got into a spin and was too low or not have the training and was unable to recover from the spin, which is why they crashed. Is that why?
No. They were capable of getting out of the spin, but the airplane wasn't capable because they'd altered the design of the airplane.
I see.
That it wouldn't have mattered if it was a aerobatic pilot that knew spins. He was unable to reacquire level flight because the airplane wouldn't let him get out of the spin.
So he may or may
and he'd been
not have
warned
known.
about that. But he didn't adhere to the warning, and it caught up with him. And I just happened to be underneath him when he came down. But that didn't deter me in me learning how to fly, or I just wanted to know how to get out of a spin.
You bet.
I wasn't cognizant of the fact that he knew that I knew that he'd altered the airplane. It didn't matter to me. It was just a spin that killed 2 people.
Right.
And so I wasn't going to get in the same scenario no matter what. And I've been in that scenario a few times, and the spin training was the most important thing I did in my entire flying career up to this point, because it's saved my bacon a lot of times.
And when you're close to the ground, if that's happening, you can feel it about to happen. You can feel it coming, so you know to recover or put that controls in the other way to recover before you even develop into a spin. So you can just nip it in the bud and stop the problem from happening if you are aware of it and have felt it, which is why it's so important to have this training.
Another reason too is to remain in control of the airplane, because the engineers who designed the airplane designed it, if it did crash, to crash forward and going down. So you got forward movement and you're going down. And if you've lost control, i.e. you're in a spin, and that's where you've lost control of the airplane, the airplane's not going to crash that way. So it's your restraint system for your shoulder harnesses and your seat belt and your seat itself, the engineering that went into the seat and the network of components that hold the seat onto the airplane and the structure that surrounds you, the aircraft. It was all designed to be going forward and down, and that's your safest bet. And if you're in a spin, you're going down, but you're not going forward.
Right, you're not going to.
You've lost control of the airplane. And even if you strike the terrain, if you're in control, then you've got the engineer's thoughts and processes and the manufacturing process on your side. I mean, you're going to be a lot better off if you have control of the airplane, no matter whether it goes into the ocean, the trees, or even if you hit a rock. The restraint system is there to help you. So anyway, that's my thought on that. But I've in the past, I've had the misfortune to have several engine failures, and so far I've never scratched a plane yet. And I think it's that early training, because I've lost engines close to the ground, way up high, and over terrain that you wouldn't want to be over, and yet I've somehow got them all down and not hurt anything.
What was the first one?
Talk about my luck. I was at the 6-hour point in my primary instruction, and the instructor, he said one day, he says, pull over to the side of the runway and I'm going to get out, and I want you to do 3 landings, and after the 3rd landing come over and pick me back up. And I said, oh, whoa, cool. So I let him out, and took off, and it was in a Cessna 150, and the takeoff was quicker. You really noticed the lack of an instructor, another person in the airplane. And I was really excited, and took off and went around, and mid downwind I pulled my carburetor heat, and everything was going textbook, and I didn't lower the nose. I kept the speed up, and when I pulled the throttle at the end of the runway opposite my point of intended touchdown, pulled the throttle back, kept the nose up, and let my speed dissipate until I got my best approach speed, and I was about to turn my base leg, and all of a sudden the prop stopped right in front of me. And I go, oh, you know, what's up with this? But I was close in as I'd been instructed to always be within gliding distance of the airport when you're doing your pattern work. And at Kenai Airport, there was no traffic to speak of. Back then, it was real quiet. And so I came in and made my approach, used the numbers given to me, and floated by my instructor and landed. Once I got down on the ground and stopped, the engine started right back up again. I went back and I picked up my instructor, and he said, "What's that all about? What happened there?" And I says, "I don't know. The engine just slowed down and quit." And he says, "Well, let's go back to the ramp and have it checked out." It just turned out to be a idle adjustment. They fixed it. But that woke me up right there to the fact that it can happen anytime and anywhere, and be ready for it. And again, I think that spin training that I took prepared me to I knew what the airplane would take, so I didn't slow it down too much. I just flew it by the numbers basically, and but that was the first one. And then I bought a Taylorcraft, and I would take it up by myself and spin it, and it spun good. I enjoyed spinning it, and it was a good airplane. And then after that, I bought a Luscombe, and then I worked my way into a T6, and I've had, as far as the engine problems go, I've only run out of fuel one time, and that was in the T6, and that happened about 4 years ago, at the Lake Hood airstrip here in Anchorage, when it wasn't my airplane. It belonged to my boss, and I went down to California and helped him recover it, and flew up here with him from California with the airplane. And he had a problem, as it turns out, with the float on the right fuel tank hanging up inside the tank. There was a baffle or something that was, the float would hang up on this thing. And
now the T6, first of all, that's a World War II trainer.
World War II trainer. That's right.
What the Army Air Corps students
tandem
would first
seating.
fly.
Instructor sat in the back, and has 600 horsepower, and it's a good flying airplane. Great airplane. It's the controls are well harmonized, and the engine's bulletproof. I mean, they're really good engines. And the prop, I mean, it's a Hamilton standard prop. Made it to a Pratt & Whitney engine, made it to a North American airframe. It's hard to beat that combination. I mean, it's just quality, quality, quality. But this one day, he had installed a new prop governor, and he wanted me to take it up, just take it one time around the pattern and see if the numbers were all, if they had it set right, correctly. And so I got in it, pre-flighted the airplane, and got in it, checked the fuel tanks, and the right fuel tank had 45 gallons indicated, and the left tank had 20 gallons in it. And so I elected to take off on the right tank, and went ahead and took the runway and got airborne. I was about half a mile off the end of the runway at about 400 feet, starting a crosswind turn to come back in the pattern, just come on in and land. And so far, takeoff RPMs were set. It was all good on the prop. I mean, the prop governor was set properly. And all of a sudden, I was just starting to enter that right turn, and the engine quit at takeoff power. And the flaps were partially up, and the gear was up in the wells. And I got on the radio real quick, and I told the tower of my predicament, and got cleared to land again, going the opposite way. Got the gear coming down, and I couldn't make the runway.
Now you're taking off on Lake Hood Strip to the west.
North.
Or to the northwest.
Yeah. Okay. I was just over the shoreline, which is about half a mile off the end of the runway there. And I got the nose down. I started a rather steep 180-degree turn back to the runway, though I was too far from the end of the runway to make it. But there's
400 feet's probably not quite enough to make a 180 back to the runway.
Oh, I had it turned around fast.
Did you?
I dropped the nose and just, the airplane's a real forgiving airplane, and I spun them. I know what they'll do. So I didn't waste. Luckily, I didn't have anybody in the airplane with me. And
so, what's your speed at this point? Are you below like an approach speed but above stall, or are you trying to go for the
stalls at 55 with the flaps and the gear down, power off stall, and I was probably indicating 65, 70.
Okay.
Because when I lost the power, I immediately lowered the nose and started to turn, because you don't waste any time, and there's nowhere to go. You've got to turn because you're over salt water. You're going to land and it was wintertime, and there was pack ice out there, and
it's not going to end well.
It wouldn't end well. And there's roads right behind you. And I was planning on landing on the access road to the airport, and it was open, no traffic. It was good. Mm-hmm. But there's power lines I had to go over, so I got the gear coming down, swapped tanks, turned from the right tank to the left tank. It's just part of my emergency checklist that I've got embedded in my mind now. And they cleared me to land, but I wasn't going to make the runway. But I wasn't dealing with that. I was going to just let that happen, because I'm not going to spend any more time talking to anybody. I'm going to fly the airplane. So down I come, and I get the gear coming down. It comes down on its own, but I didn't have the engine back yet. And only a few seconds have gone by since all this started. And so I'm on the wobble pump and switch tanks on the wobble pump to bring the fuel up from the tank to the engine.
Now the wobble pump is a manual fuel pump.
It's a manual fuel pump
that you would normally do when you're going to start the airplane.
That's correct. Yeah, you bring the fuel from the wing, which is sitting underneath you. You got to bring it up to the engine to do its thing. And anyway, I was really operating the fuel pump fast, and I knew I wasn't going to make the runway, so I lined up with the little road there and was coming down. Everything was going good. I was going to make the road, and all of a sudden I cleared the power lines, and all of a sudden the engine came back. And when the engine came back, I changed my direction of flight to the end of the runway, and went ahead and went in and landed, and pulled over to the far end of the runway and off the runway, and shut the engine down, and got out, and I looked inside, put my eyeballs on that right tank, and it was dead. It still indicated 45 gallons of fuel, but there wasn't a drop of fuel in the tank. And that said, oh my God, you dummy, you should have opened that cap and looked down and actually put your eyeballs on that fuel, because that had never happened to me before, having a float hang up on a baffle like that. And but
no, that's a good lesson. A couple lessons that I can think of as I'm listening to you, like on the pre-flight, go ahead and really check the fuel in any airplane.
That's right. That's right. Get up there and look down and make sure that fuel's actually in there.
Take the time to do that. Yeah. The other thing that I noticed, when I was in the Navy, they always beat into us: aviate, navigate, communicate, in that order. If you're not flying the airplane, none of the other stuff matters. So when the tower was talking to you, it didn't matter. You needed to fly the airplane at that point.
Yeah, I did. But I did talk to the tower, and because there was a Cessna 180 that was right behind me, and he was going to take the runway. And I'm just glad that he hadn't taken the runway when I came in and landed, because that would have been a conflict, and that would have put me in a bad way. If he's on the runway taking off, heading right towards me, there's really not an adequate taxiway alongside the runway to land on. Mm-hmm. They've got a line of airplanes right there, and you have to taxi through there slow, and then there's like swamp around that airport, and it's not a good scenario.
So when you told the tower, I lost an engine or I have an emergency, the tower controller...
I didn't even get that far with them. I said the last two numbers of my registration number, and I said returning to land. I didn't ask for permission. I said that's what's happening. Mm-hmm. And that young lady that was running the tower, she came back immediately. She said cleared as requested, like instantly, which made me feel really good.
So she was on top of it, stopped that 182 from
going. Apparently. I didn't
stopped
hear that.
Everybody.
I didn't hear that conversation.
Or at least didn't clear them.
Yeah, but this whole thing took less than 20 seconds to happen. By the time I lifted off the ground till I was back on the ground was just a few. It wasn't very long at all.
So the other thing,
things happen fast. You've got to have a plan.
And while you're thinking, you were still able to go through your procedures, swap the tank, which is one of them, and which saved you from having to land on the road. Yeah,
in an emergency, the thinking process speeds up. I mean, fast. I mean, you got to think fast, because time is altitude. You know, if you waste time, you're burning your altitude. Altitude is your energy reserve, and an energy reserve is your life blood. I mean, that's, if you've got altitude, you can save your life easier. If you're down in the treetops, the time and your energy left to manipulate to save you and the airplane, or the airplane and you, is the way I look at it. If you don't scratch your plane, people in the airplane's not going to get hurt. So don't let that airplane get scratched. You do whatever it takes to save that airplane.
So it sounds like you think this stuff through before you even go, like have a plan.
Oh yeah, and as I'm flying along, I keep looking for areas where I can turn around if I have a problem and land on. And then wind direction. I always keep an eye on which way the wind's blowing. So that kind of aspect of the emergency is kind of built into you. So if something happens, man, you can just turn and you're not wasting any time, like looking around for smoke or looking around to wave action to determine the wind direction. As I'm flying along VFR, I know which way the wind's blowing all the time and where. Yeah, this kind of stuff's happened to me enough. I'm really cognizant of what's around me and the environment I'm in.
Sure.
Yeah.
You told me a story about one, I think you were taking off out of Kenai, and where you landed on the road and over a RV, and then there was a lady in front of you.
Oh no, that was here in Anchorage.
Oh, that was in Anchorage.
Yeah,
okay.
That was here in Anchorage. I was ferrying a Luscombe to Dutch Harbor for a friend of mine who got transferred as a mechanic from Anchorage down to Dutch Harbor, and it's about a 900-mile flight. Little bit of it's over water, but I'd made the flight several times before. It's no big deal. And this airplane, they'd put a 90-horse Continental on it, and it was an 8A that was left the factory with a 65 Continental, and it was a real hot rod. I was really impressed with the way this thing flew and got off the ground, did really well. Anyway,
before you go, but the Luscombe is a 2-seat side-by-side tail dragger.
Yeah, most of them were built all metal. Some of them have rag wings. Yeah, it's conventionally geared.
Conventional means a wheel on the tail.
Yeah, tail wheel airplane. And excuse me. And fun airplane. I've had several of them. They're a great little airplane. They require a little bit more thought flying it. Whoop. Good to go? Okay. They got a little bit stiffer landing gear than most of the little airplanes you fly around, so the secret is just keep them straight and you'll be okay. I've never had a problem with them at all. But this day I had 2 5-gallon cans of gas in the back, behind the seat, and they were strapped in really well. I had my survival gear. Up here in Alaska, you have to fly with in summer they have a list that you're required to have in the airplane. In wintertime, that changes a little bit due to the cold weather environment that you fly through. So I had my survival gear, plus I had extra fuel, and so off I go. And this strip where this airplane was located was a short little strip, and I got about 2/3 of the way. I was committed on the strip. I got about 2/3 of the way down the runway, and the RPM started to drop off. And I'm committed. And there's just a swamp with water and dead trees off the end of the strip. So
there's no stopping.
No, there's no. So I was committed. So I got the airplane in the air, and as soon as I cleared the treetops, I knew the way that I was losing power, that I wouldn't be able to fly out and make a 180 return to land, that I was going to have to land on the highway. And the highway was 2-lane at that time, and it was busy. It was a weekend, and there was traffic going and coming from both directions. It was really no place for me to land. So I made the crosswind, and then I made the highway. I knew I was going to be able to make the highway. I didn't know if I was going to be able to mix with the traffic down there, because it was pretty heavy both directions. But I was committed, and I knew I thought I could do it. So I came in, lined up with the pavement, and there was about, I don't know, maybe 75 feet between the vehicles in both lanes, and they're all doing 60 miles an hour. So,
which is about what the Luscombe would be doing on final.
So I just lined myself up with and there was a camper pickup with a big camper shell on it, and I could see that. And so I went over the top of it, and I got over to the right just a little bit so that, and luckily the people coming towards me all got down as far as they could off the edge of the road, the facing traffic. The cars that I was going over, I was a total surprise to all those folks. And I went over the top of the camper, and like I say, there wasn't much room, 75 feet between it and the car in front of him. And I settled in front of the camper, and luckily the car that I was following kept on going. The camper slowed down a little bit, and I made the driveway going down into this little airport, and I went down in there, and the camper followed me in, and I got out, and he got out, and I went up to the prop, and the prop was, it was solid. It froze up, it was just...
So the engine was frozen.
The engine was frozen up. It had 5 quarts of oil in it, plus I had half a gallon of oil, extra oil with me, just in case, and never did find out what exactly was the cause of the failure, because they put another engine on it. But that's one when that spin training came in handy, because I knew what I could do with the airplane, and how to keep control of it, and you just keep your cool. And my left wingtip was right over the center line of the road, so actually the traffic coming down from the opposite direction, they still had room to get by, on my approach, and getting off the highway as soon as possible helped too. I didn't slow traffic down too much. They kept right on going, but I felt very lucky indeed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now there was one in the Cook Inlet in the Stinson.
Yeah, I was working as a carpenter for a fellow down in Girdwood, and he didn't know how to fly, but he acquired this 108 Stinson with a Franklin engine on it, in some kind of land trade or house trade or something like that. And he learned that I knew how to fly, and he asked me if I'd go into Merrill Field and pick it up one day and bring it out to Girdwood and just park it there. And so I did. I went in town, and he said if I wouldn't mind, every once in a while he might ask me to fly him somewhere so he could look at some property or a house or whatever. I said, oh yeah, any chance to go flying, I'm all for it. So one day he said, I need to fly down to Homer to look at some land timber sales. I want to look at it from the air and see what it's like. So we flew down there in the Stinson. Everything's going good. And on the way back, we stopped in Kenai and got a hamburger and topped the tanks off on the Stinson, and then headed back towards Girdwood, and the engine started to falter about halfway back. And I was over land, and I thought, man, there's no place out in this area. I knew the area very well. No place to land. So I headed directly to the beach, which was about 4 miles away. And I was able to keep 1,400 RPM, so that helped me stretch my glide. But I knew that I wasn't going to be able to maintain altitude or limp back even. So the best option was to land on the beach. And I'd landed on that beach lots of times. It's a good beach. There's obstacles, sometimes driftwood and big rocks you got to watch out for. All in all, it's a pretty good beach to land on. The trouble is, in October, we get these high tides, these fall tides. And I was just hoping that the tide would be at a partial tide, like going in or out or whatever.
Right.
But accommodate enough beach to land on. Well, as soon as I cleared the treetops and turned into the wind, I found out that it was at high tide on a very high tide, and the waves were just crashing into the cliff, and I didn't have any beach to land, so I had to land about 60 feet offshore in about 5 foot of water. And the airplane, I still had that 1,400 RPM, so with full flaps, I was able to pull the nose up, and I was able to really land as slow as the airplane was capable of landing, which is about 50 miles an hour. But because of the wind was blowing 20, our over the water speed at that time was probably around 25 to 30. And so we set down at that speed, and the tail came up and gray water wrapped around the windshield. It's the scariest thing you can ever imagine.
I mean, it stopped pretty quick when you got
Oh,
the
it
water.
did. It did. I couldn't tell how fast it stopped because the gray water, it got dark and it was just a mess. And so the tail came back down, and the owner of the airplane, he's sitting in the right
So
seat.
it did not flip over.
No, it didn't flip over.
Yeah.
No, no. It was just sitting out there floating around. And the waves were about 3 foot high. You know, the wind had created some surf. So
go ahead.
the owner jumped out and he ran up on the bank, and I got out on the left side, and I was about, my head was out of the water, and that's how deep it was.
Pretty deep, though.
Yeah, it was deep. But every once in a while, you could sense the airplane, the tires are touching, hitting. And I got back to the tail, and I turned the tail towards the beach, and he was already up on the bank, yelling at me to get out of the water, just let the airplane go. And I just yelled back at him and says, "Come down here and help me. How are we going to get home?" And so anyway, I just kept pushing on it, and every time a wave would hit it, it'd lift the airplane up, and I'd get a little bit more. And finally, I got it close enough to where he came down and helped me get the tail up on the bank. We had the thing at about a 30-degree angle or 40-degree angle, however steep that bluff is there. And tide was going out, so pretty soon we had the airplane dry, and but the radio wouldn't work. It had gotten wet, and it just wouldn't work. And so we walked down the beach, and I tied the airplane down the best we could, and walked down the beach about half a mile and found a cabin that had been abandoned.
Now, this is October. It would be
I'm
pretty cool.
Oh, I'm
cold.
purple, man. I'm so cold, and I don't smoke. I never smoked. But he smoked cigars, and he had a lighter. So we were able to get a fire going in this cabin.
So you could say that might have, the fact that he smoked probably saved your lives.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
See,
yeah.
Kids, get some Chesterfields.
No, don't. Highly don't recommend that at all. Anyway. So we got back there, and it got a fire going, and that was kind of weird because there was really nothing to start a fire with. There was a bunch of driftwood, but I found some fire starter up in the attic of this place in the form of early Playboy magazines. And I threw them down out of the attic onto the floor, and I made a 55-gallon barrel into a stove, set it on some rocks in there, and I got a good fire going.
Now, did you look through them and go, "Oh, we got to save this one"?
I lit them off as fast as I could.
Lit them off.
Yeah.
Thanks,
I threw
sweetheart.
a bunch of driftwood in there, and as it turns out, what happened was that an exhaust valve seat came loose and got caught underneath the open valve and held that valve open, so the cylinder lost compression, and one cylinder out of the 6 failed, and the airplane wouldn't stay in the air. It came down. And
Even with the one gone.
with one gone, yeah. So it was coming down.
Which is the Franklin engine, which you have.
It's a Franklin engine. I'm not a fan of Franklins anymore.
Yeah, I'll bet.
But anyway.
So what happened to the airplane? So now it's sitting on the beach. Now, okay, so now you're in the cabin, and you got a fire, so you're getting warmed up, dried out.
The radio won't work.
The radio won't work.
So we're waiting on, and we'd file a flight plan with his wife. I mean, I didn't file a flight plan to go to Homer and back because we figured it'd be just a short little trip, no big deal. And it turned out to be a big deal. And when he didn't show up that night, his wife called everybody in the book, FAA, the state police, everything, and they started a search next day, and a C-130 flew over and flew down the beach and spotted us on the beach. And eventually a mechanic came over with a cylinder, and we put the cylinder on it and dried the airplane out. Spent a couple of days doing that, and then flew it back with no brakes. The brakes were gone because the salt water had ate up the brakes. And
so you saved the airplane.
Saved the airplane, yeah.
So the lessons from that, listening to the story, again, fly the airplane.
Yeah, fly the airplane.
And you flew it right into the water. You didn't stall it and trying to stay airborne, which would have could have been a stall spin accident. So you just flew the airplane.
Yeah. There's no way I'm going to spin a plane in.
No,
there is no way. No, if you if you're underneath one like I was when I was a kid, and take up flying, you're not going to spin in.
Right. Keep your airspeed.
Yeah. So.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of ways that could have gone south on you. That could have been bad.
Yeah, could have been offshore farther. In which case, the weird thing about Cook Inlet is it freezes over to a certain point in the wintertime with ice that can get up to 10, 12 foot thick. And in the summertime, the ice goes away, but the temperature between the summer and the winter in Upper Cook Inlet is only 5 degrees. So in the summertime, you think you're landing in warm water. You are not. That water is really cold. And people say you succumb after 15 minutes. Well, that's not true. You might succumb from a lack of oxygen, because what happened to me in the 5 or 10 minutes that I was in the water trying to get this airplane to where we could save it was I changed colors, and then I couldn't breathe. My chest muscles kind of just froze up, and I was actually using neck muscles to get a little bit of air. It was the strangest thing. As soon as I got out of the water, that changed, and I started to get my breathing back. But that's what your muscles stop working. Like for swimming over, it just, the state of Alaska's got a video out, and it shows these guys jumping in the water down by Kodiak, and it's an educational video, and they're real close to the shore, and they can't make, and these are big, strong guys, and they can't make it to the shore. I mean, it's big. Landing in the water is not a good thing.
So you would rather land
anywhere but in the water.
Anywhere, okay.
Yeah. That cold water feels like 1,000 needles. I mean, it's just unbelievable, uncomfortable. In fact, it starts to bring a feeling of panic over you. This is what I noticed too.
You have no control.
Yeah, and
your body.
Yeah, you're totally immersed in this cold water, and you feel your breathing start to go away right away, and a kind of a panic come over you. And but the panic of the thought of not having an airplane to fly home. I stuck with it. I stuck with it anyway, and I was so close. I could have let the airplane go and just got up on the shore, and been all right. But no. Anyway, saved it and got back. Everything's good now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that was one of my early failures too. Then I've had on that same runway about 3 years ago, I flew a Citabria off the runway, same direction, taken off to the north, got about 70 feet in the air, and the engine quit. Fuel starvation, and it had full tanks. Well, we just topped it off.
And this was a 0320 Lycoming?
No,
it was an ECA, a 115?
It was a 135 horse Lycoming 0290 D2.
Okay.
And a good engine, lots of power. And I got in the air about 70 feet. I had the owner of the airplane in the back seat. He was a volunteer at the museum, and they'd put this airplane together at the museum. And we've got on-site IAs that inspected it, and then they called me and they asked me if I'd fly it up to Palmer for some radio work. And I said, sure. And so we went out there and pre-flighted it, taxied out. I ran it up really good because it had been sitting in this guy's backyard for a couple of years, And took off to the north and got right at the end of the strip and about 70 feet of altitude, and then it just quit. Just cold turkey, just quiet, And so there's that access road, and it's just a straight shot right to Northern Lights, which is about 3/4 of a mile away. It's a straight, not there's a couple signs you have to go around if you had to land there. And so right off the bat, I said, well, that's where I'm headed, because you can't turn around. 70 feet, you cannot turn around.
Not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. If you attempt attempt a sharp turn off of that, you're asking for trouble, especially if you haven't gone through the spin training to know how far you can stretch that thing. I don't recommend a 180-degree turn unless you've got plenty of altitude and you know your airplane quite well. And So I look down, and there's a bicyclist, and he's got his back to me, and he's right where I need to be, and so that option's gone. So now
Right.
that
You
option's
can't run 'em
gone,
over. Yeah.
and at 70 feet, I'm splitting a second into about 1,000 parts. I mean, and so immediately my right wing comes up, and I start a left turn, and now there's another around the corner is another little straightaway, and I says, well, I think I can make. I think I got enough energy, but we're slowing down, and we're starting to settle pretty good. And at 70 feet, you only have a few seconds. So I got lined up on that next section of road that goes to a four-way stop, and I was about 20 feet in the air, and there's a fence and a row of airplanes parked, and then there's light standards about 30 foot in the air, about every 200 feet. And it just so happened as I rolled out of the turn and started to line up for the straightaway, and I had that made, no traffic, no pedestrians, bicycles, or anything. I says, well, I said to myself, I've got enough energy to make the echo parking. So I just kind of washed past that one light standard and settled down right in front of the planes. And then I was down and stopped. It was all good.
Wow.
It was a lucky deal. But it's only because, and in that one turn, that final turn, I could feel the nibble on that left wing. And so I unloaded that left wing just a little bit because I could feel it wanting to go, And then again, that spin training and stall
And
practice.
that goes back to that training.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah, it saved me a lot of times.
That's a typical thing. Like if you didn't have that training, and you're thinking, I don't have enough energy, and if you pull back on that stick,
she's going to give
it's
up.
going to be gone.
Yeah,
it's going to give up.
The wing just drops. Yeah, and then the instinctive reaction to a wing dropping, of course, is to add aileron. When you add aileron to a situation like that, you just increase the amount of yaw, and the wing just goes faster. And
you get more induced drag.
a flight instructor will take you up, and he'll show you how to keep that from happening. I'm not a flight instructor, so I can't
Use the rudders in that situation.
I can't suggest too much.
Oh,
rudder.
Forget the aileron slow.
Rudder is a lifesaver in these situations. Yeah.
And what was the matter with that airplane?
The inlet screen in the carburetor was plugged. The fuel lines were all open. Everything was good except the little tiny inlet screen that's embedded inside the carburetor as a last safety device to keep contamination from entering the carburetor. And when we got back to the hangar, and they took that out and looked at it, and usually that part of the fuel system doesn't get inspected every year. It can be, most people just let that go, I guess, but not me anymore.
Not anymore, right?
It's not a pre-flight action because you got to remove the cowling. It's something you do on a 100-hour or an annual, but it didn't occur this time. And but the owner of the airplane now does it religiously.
I'll bet he does.
A lot.
Yep.
Not a word out of him. Yep. He was quiet the whole time, and but anyway,
That's good.
got out of that one. And there's been too many for me. But I haven't scratched a plane yet, and I feel really lucky.
Knock on wood. I've never had one, and I like to think that you've taken some of mine for me.
Oh,
so many.
Yeah. Well,
you've done more than your share.
I hope people can learn that this can happen anytime. I mean, it can happen anytime, and it's going to be up to you to manage your energy, manage your airspeed, and manage the time that you have available to you. And you don't have to wait for a unclustered highway or an airport with a runway that there's nobody on. You can make do. If you learn to fly your airplane, you can make do with substantially less than what you're normally used to, like landing in real tight spots. I made some landings that you had to take the airplane apart, to get it out of there. But no, I never scratched one yet. It was just almost
what was the one
spooky
that you were delivering Super Cub in the winter?
Oh, yeah. That was a brand new Cub build with 180 horse Lycoming. Really a nice airplane. Beautiful airplane. They sold it to a fella in Kansas, and they asked me, this is a midwinter trip, and I've pretty much given up cross country through Canada in the wintertime. It's just a harsh environment, and too harsh. And delivering an airplane, it's a lot of work in the wintertime.
Mm-hmm.
There's pre-flight, there's heating, and all kinds of issues, weather and light. You're in the wintertime up here, you lose a lot of your light. It gets down to 4 hours of light a day, and so that's not a big window for cross-country flying. I'm a VFR pilot. There's no VFR at night in Canada, so you're limited there. And then the weather and the mountains and the terrain, and it's just not a comfortable thing to do. And so anyway, I was flying down. I was in British Columbia. I was in the mountains, and I'd gone through entered a mountain pass, and no road underneath me, and I ran into a snow squall, and I turned around, made a 180-degree turn, and went back down, and picked up the highway again, and was going to go follow the highway around.
Can I stop right
Oh,
there?
sure.
Because there's another lesson to be had.
Okay.
One of the biggest or greatest number of accidents for VFR pilots is continued flight into IMC, flying into the clouds as a VFR pilot. So before you even get to this next problem, you could have had a lot worse problem if you just kept going and trying to punch through. You could have iced up. You could have, and if you're a VFR pilot, maybe you don't have the skill, or maybe you don't have the equipment on board, whether it's the pilot or the equipment. A lot of VFR accidents are VFR pilot flying into IMC or flying into the clouds. That's very common. But of course, with your experience, you realized, and this is how you nip it in the bud. You can always stop this chain of accidents. The earlier, the better.
That's
right. So you're like, oh, snow squall, turn around. Rather than, I think I can sneak through. Maybe it's not so thick or all that. You might get away with it 9 times out of 10, but eventually you're not going to. So right there, number one, that was a great call. Just turn around.
Yeah, turn around. 180-degree turn, going to cost you fuel, time. It's the best thing you can ever do.
Yes, and it doesn't matter what you have to do on the other end.
That's right. Believe me, it's not worth it. And a lot of people, they find themselves squeaking through there, scud running, and they make it, and that just gives them the thought process that if they did it once or twice or 6 or 8, 10, 12 times, the next time they're going to get through no problem because they've got the experience to scud run. It proves itself wrong all the time up here.
Bad idea.
All the time. Experienced pilots, inexperienced pilots, they all hit cumulogranite or a terrain someday. It's bad. So I just don't recommend it. No. Stay in the clear. That's for sure. I just fly in good weather anyway.
Yes, I do too. They say when I'm in little airplanes, oh, you fly IFR? Yes, I follow roads.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. And that saved me this time. So I made the 180-degree turn, picked up the highway again, and continued my flight onto my destination. But I hadn't picked up the road. I was back on the road about 10 minutes. And you know how you do your instrument scan or your eyes my eyes are always keen, oil pressure and so forth. If there's anything that moves on that instrument panel, my eyes go right to it. And I saw a needle flicker, and I looked down at the oil pressure, and was that the one I saw flicker? And I was looking at the oil pressure gauge, and all of a sudden the needle just went from 65 pounds, bonk, right down to 0. And I was over the highway, so I thought, this is a brand new engine on this brand new Super Cub. I just reached up and turned the key off, just like that.
Right, because you kept running it with no oil pressure. You're just going to ruin the engine.
1,500 feet above the highway, and a 2-lane paved road. And it was a pretty nice road, too, and no obstructions to speak of. And I looked down right underneath me, and there is an intersection, and the only truck stop and gas station for miles and miles is right underneath me. So I landed on the highway out and coasted into around the little restaurant and gas station and parked in the back. And what happened was when they rebuilt the airplane, they made the crankcase drain that alleviates any crankcase buildup, smoke and pressure and so forth. it was out in the slipstream, and it should have been cut off flush with the fuselage, so it's not in that cold weather. It was 20 below zero, and the moisture in that thing froze up, and it put enough pressure on the internal part of the engine that it actually cracked the oil cooler. It had a steel oil cooler, and it broke all the engine oil, lubricating oil, vacated the engine, and that's when I noticed the fall, and I noticed it right there, so I didn't injure the engine. And I landed, and I walked in the restaurant, and I sat down, and you could hear a pin drop. There was about a dozen truckers and so forth in there, about a dozen rigs out in the parking lot. And I sat down, the guy right next to me, he said, "Do you do that very often?" I said, no. And they had a telephone at the booth, so I called Air Radio. I got them on the line. And just when I shut the engine off, I got Air Radio on my radio and told them I was having engine problems and where I was at. And then I lost contact with them because as I'm settling down, I lost the ability to talk to them. Mm-hmm. And so I was on a flight plan, and I told them where I was located, and they actually launched a rescue helicopter coming my way. And by the time I got them on the telephone to tell them I was down safe and where I was at, that they had already launched a helicopter to come out and check on me. I thought that was pretty neat.
That's really neat, especially with that kind of weather.
Yeah.
They're on it.
Yeah. And so anyway, about a half an hour later, a trooper shows up to make a report, and he sat down, and I bought him a cup of coffee and a piece of pie, and we had a nice conversation, and he gave me his card, and he says, "When you get ready to leave, when you fix your airplane problem, give me a call. I'll come stop traffic for you." And I says, this thing takes off in about 100 feet. In wintertime, there wasn't much traffic up there. And I thanked him, but I said I'd probably get out by myself. And so it took a couple days to get the parts required and the oil, because it emptied all 8-10 quarts out of that crankcase. There wasn't any oil left in it. Mm-hmm. And but anyway, we checked. I had a mechanic come up from down south, and he checked the airplane over, and he says it's fine. You saved the engine by shutting it down like I did. Anyway, I continued on to Kansas with the airplane, delivered it, and everything was good. But
everything was fine.
Yeah. So no more winter trips for me. That cold weather is just. It's okay if everything's operating properly and doing all right. It's still a hassle pre-flighting and warming the engine up, and doing all that, wing covers and so forth. But if everything's operating okay, it's okay. But I'm not taking any more winter flights. No.
So from listening to you tell all these stories, I'm learning a few things. One, it does, like, I've been flying since I was 18, so I've been flying for 40 something years. Mm-hmm. It still could happen to me. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're someone that's been flying for 2 weeks and have 10 hours and just soloed. It could happen to anybody. Planning is really important. Knowing your airplane, and even if you don't have to do spins, if you could get a flight instructor to teach you them, even though it's not required legally, just so you can get used to the airplane. And then when something does happen to you, number one, fly the airplane. Fly the airplane, fly the airplane, fly the airplane, because if you don't, nothing else matters. And even if you're going to crash, fly it into the ground, into the terrain.
That's part of the beauty or the good points of learning spins is that when an emergency does occur, even though airspeed might not come into that emergency whatsoever, you might have an airport right underneath you, it unloads that burden on your mind about maintaining control of the airplane, because that's already known knowledge, and it's stored back there, and you can focus on other things, other traffic, and it alleviates some of that stress, knowing that capability of you and your airplane. Because every time a real emergency happens, stress comes into play. I don't care how cool of a pilot you are. There's a level of stress that comes into play every time, and this really helps a lot.
And going to the planning, you might want to think for your airplane and your capabilities. You might want to think, gosh, if I have an engine failure on takeoff, you might want to have a number that you're comfortable with, an altitude for your personal capabilities in the airplane. Where do I feel comfortable making a 180-degree turn back to the runway? Because if you try and do it too low, you're asking for a stall spin accident.
That's right.
To have that number in your head, and as you pass it, go, okay, now I can turn around. And it may be different depending on the airplane and your capabilities, but it might be a little higher than you think.
I was ferrying a Stinson L5 for the Planes of Fame Air Museum from Anchorage to Los Angeles one summer, and it has 190 horse Lycoming on it, and I had been cleared for takeoff at Fort St. John and along the Alcan Highway, and I took off, and I was about 300 foot in a long runway. I mean, it's 7,000 or 8,000 foot long, and I was about midway down the runway at about 400 foot altitude, and the engine coughed out. I mean, it didn't die completely, but you knew something serious had happened to the engine. And I just pulled the nose up and did not a wing over, but an aggressive turn, doing a 180-degree turn, and landed going the opposite way. And it turned out that when the engine had been overhauled, they put ground power unit cylinders on it, and two of the cylinders were cracked. And I had no idea, but when the engine heated up so far, the cracks would open up, and that's what happened. The cracks on these two cylinders opened up, and I lost the use of those two cylinders, and I just made that 180-degree turn right there. But I had lots of runway behind me and plenty of experience, so it was a safe turn. But most people would say that probably wasn't a good thing to do, but I was 400 feet and knew what the airplane could do and had lots of runway behind me. I could have made a less aggressive turn, a gradual turn, and landed fine. But I just wanted to get it pointed the right way, and I actually could have probably turned. I mean, landed straight ahead. I still had 1,500 foot or 2,000 feet in front of me, and I could have done that, but the ramp was behind me, so I wanted my energy to take me back to the ramp, and it did. I rolled right in off the runway and onto the ramp again. Turned out that 3 of the cylinders had cracks in them, and they had to ship up from Los Angeles. They had to ship up 3 new cylinders assemblies, and the FBO down there put the engine back together again for me, and I continued on. But yeah, that's just one of them. And then another T6 incident, not an accident, incident. I was lifting off with my T6 from Birchwood one time, and I got about 50 foot in the air, and I had the gear coming up in the wells, and the flaps were still deployed. I think I had 20 degrees of flaps set for takeoff that day, and all of a sudden, boom! It sounded like a rifle shot, and oil all over the windshield. I thought, my engine just blew up. Great.
But at least you can't see.
And now, you can't. Well, yeah, you can't. You can open the canopy,
right?
Side wash the airplane a little bit and see. But yeah, your forward vision is kind of shot. So when there's nowhere to go really off that southerly takeoff, except a big swamp, and when that engine blew, I knew I couldn't get the gear down and land with the remaining runway. I was almost out of runway, and it was just a big stump farm out there for the approach at that time. So I made a slight turn to the right and headed for a swamp. And my mind was, my dad had a crane company. He had this one great big crane, a Manitowoc with about 250, 300 foot of stick on it. And I was already thinking about bringing that crane out. If I could land
while you're still in
close enough to the bluff in the swamp there, if I was going to have to sit down, if I got close enough, I could reach out and pick the airplane up and set it back up on the... Anyway, but I got, as a few more seconds went by, I noticed the airplane wasn't settling, so I still had some power. So, but that right turn from the center line of the runway, making a slight right turn, set me up for a teardrop. So I got the gear coming back down, and I came around and I landed going the opposite direction. And as soon as I made the runway, I shut the engine down, just turned the switch off.
Now, how high were you on this whole turn that you're making power?
About 100 feet, maybe. 100.
And you had enough power to keep the speed, put the
Yeah,
gear
I
down,
wasn't. Yeah, I was maintaining altitude.
and the flaps stayed at 20 degrees the whole time?
Yeah, and then I got the gear back down again and came in and landed. And as soon as I made the runway, I turned the switch off because I didn't want to grind my engine up. I didn't know what had happened, you know. And so I stopped on the runway, and one of the locals there came out with a car and tied onto me and towed me back to the ramp. And I put the airplane back in the hangar, and I was so shook up. I won't lie to you. I'm not really brave, you know. I was so shook up, I didn't even want to look at the engine because I just thought it was just going to be a jumbled up mess underneath all that oil. And it turns out that the number 5 cylinder, which is on a 1340 Pratt & Whitney, is the master rod cylinder. It's the one.
Now this is a radial engine.
A radial, 600 horse radial engine, very dependable engine. As it turns out, I blew the top of one cylinder off. It cracked all the way around. What was keeping it on was a cowling, goes over the top of it and holds it together. And I guess from what the engine shop told me, when this happens, and it happens quite a bit to the crop dusters down in the States, they bead blasted and overhaul these cylinders so many times it weakens them in certain spots, and mine just happened to give up. But it sure sounded bad and looked bad. And that night I went back with a flashlight and I was looking all around in there, and you could see the crack. It was about 1/8 of an inch separation on the head, and that's what happened. And I called other Aero Engines the next morning, and they said that happens all the time down here to the crop dusters. He said you just need a new cylinder stud assembly, so anyway, they fixed me up with a cylinder and a matching piston, and I had my IA come over, and the two of us put it on, and life was good after that.
Good.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So that's just another one. Anyway, I've had.
Well, this is really great getting these stories. I think what I'd like to do, another one we can talk about. I know you have a love affair with the T6s. I'd like to get into that on another one.
Sure.
I know you have a bunch of boat stories, and another bunch of stories that fascinate me is all the recoveries of World War II aircraft around Alaska, and I'd like to do some other ones, you know, in the future.
Yeah, I was one of the founders of the Alaska Aviation Museum, and I've done about 35 recoveries for them. My first recovery was a P-51A that crashed up here in the war. It was a cold weather flying test bed, and I recovered that for a gentleman in Ohio, and Allison powered P-51, and that's a story in itself because that was a big job.
I'd like to get that whole story, but I think I'd like to do it on a different one.
Sure.
And then we can get a bunch
Very
of
cool.
these. That's great.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
You're sure welcome.
This is really fun.
Anytime. I love this.
Yeah, this is great. I do too. It's just fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.